The Chancellor Hotel's security office was a small space at the back of the lobby, barely large enough to accommodate a chair, a desk, and an antiquated security monitor that was buzzing static. Daniel Carter had sat in that chair for 6 years, watching screens filled with nothing. This was the last week he was here. The hotel was closed, and destruction was planned by the end of the month. It had finally withered from the inside out, after decades of waning grandeur, worse economy, poor management. Leaning back, he stretched. His chair protested with a sigh. He was holding lukewarm coffee, the type that spent too much time in a machine that was never thoroughly cleaned. Anyway, he took a sip. The security screens in front of him flickered, showing him pixelated black and white video from the hotel's final cameras. Two perspectives. One pointed to the lobby, which had once been lavishly decorated with chandeliers and sparkling marble but was now empty. Its furniture covered in white blankets like corpses. The other was locked on the lift bank, where a row of doors stood like silent guardians, waiting for guests who would never come back. He had an easy shift. Watch the cameras, walk the halls, keep things quiet until morning. The job was that. It has always been. A deep, mechanical groan drifted through the building somewhere behind the walls, possibly the sound of an old pipe settling, or even the bones of the structure shifting in their sleep. Daniel wiped his jaw and let out a breath. 6 years. This chair, this coffee, and these identical blank screens for 6 years. And he had the feeling that something was watching him tonight for the first time in 6 years. He hardly paid attention as he flicked through the camera feeds. The lobby didn't move. The chandeliers wobbled a little, disturbed by an invisible breeze. The thick layer of dust that had gathered over the counters had muffled what had once been the center of attention in an expensive establishment. Then he changed to the feed from the lift and stopped. There was an open lift door. That was incorrect. Daniel narrowed his eyes at the shaky video as he sat forward. The panel above the doors was viewable, but the camera wasn't the best. Low resolution, flashing a little. He anticipated seeing lobby receive a L. Instead, the digital screen flickered, shifted, and finally landed on an impossibility. B1. A grimace appeared on his face. There was no B1. There was no basement for the Chancellor. There was nothing but solid concrete underneath the lobby, and he had worked here long enough to know every inch of the building. No tunnels for maintenance, no levels of storage. So why the hell was the lift lowered? Daniel clicked the camera feedback for a few seconds, replaying the video. The lift doors were closed at 11:44. They slipped open, empty, at 11:45. He had no idea why, but his stomach grew tight. Just a bug in the system. Half of the maintenance crew had already departed weeks before, and the hotel's circuits were decades old. Elevators constantly break down. His fingers continued to hover over the radio that was fastened to his belt. He paused. Even so, who was he going to call? No one was here. There was no one at the front desk. The maintenance crew had already left for their next assignments. He was the sole employee still working there. Therefore, whatever caused the lift to trip, it was also by itself Daniel leaned back in his chair and shook his head. He was being ridiculous. He looked over the system logs. Nothing unusual. No access without a keycard. No override by hand. Human hands had not caused whatever had happened to Elevator 2. On the security stream, the lift doors were still open. Not a move. No travelers. Daniel gave his eyes a rub. Even though his shift had only begun, it already seemed excessively long. He was going to switch to a different camera and change the stream when the picture flickered. Then he briefly caught a glimpse of something inside the lift. His blood froze. At the rear of the lift, there was a figure. It was tall, still, not moving. Details were difficult to see in the grainy black and white video, but Daniel could tell. It was orientated incorrectly. Inside, whoever or whatever was facing away from the camera. Its arms dangled rigidly at its sides, not moving. Uncertain of what he was even looking at, his fingers lingered over the keyboard. The figure then shifted. It's not a natural motion. It was convulsing sharply as if something had snapped inside its spine. Then, the video stream went dark. The image was replaced by a deep, empty hum as a surge of static hissed through the speakers. Daniel's heart was racing as he gazed at the television. He waited. The screen didn't light up. He extended his hand to tweak the signal feed, but to no avail. He tried to control his breathing and let out a sharp exhale. Error. That's all this was. An outdated, unreliable system in a decaying hotel. However, he couldn't get rid of the feeling that whatever was in that lift had pivoted. Now there was a greater stillness in the security office. With his fingers tapping absently against the desk, Daniel continued to stare at the dead monitor. Then a telephone rang from someplace in the hotel. A loud, jagged sound pierced the deserted corridor. The front desk was not the source. None of the rooms were the source. It originated within the lift. The ringing phone was an intrusion. In the silence of the deserted hotel, a harsh, strange noise. Daniel remained motionless in his seat, staring at the surveillance screen that showed the open lift. Someone inside was making the call. His instinct advised him to ignore it. His body, however, was already in motion. After grabbing his flashlight and fastening the radio to his belt, he pushed open the door of the security office. In front of him, the foyer was unnaturally silent. The glass decorations on the chandeliers clattered like wind chimes when they moved slightly. The phone continued to ring. He moved slowly and deliberately in the direction of Elevator 2. Through his radio came a quick jolt of static, a sudden burst of white noise so short he nearly missed it. He stopped, turned the volume up. Nothing. A sinking, empty sensation took hold of his chest. The dim interior of the lift was visible through the open doors. The phone was on the floor, its cable too tight. Receiver was removed. Daniel hesitated. There was no way to remove the emergency phones. They were wired into the panel, but this is not how they were meant to be. His fingers hovered over the receiver. A shiver ran up his back. Then he lifted it up cautiously. Static. A hollow, deep hum. Then, a voice. Daniel. The voice of his own. Daniel dropped the phone. It clicked sharply to the ground. His reflection in the mirrors didn't look right. A fraction of a second behind, delayed, lagging just enough to be noticeable. His breath caught. The light above flickered erratically. When he blinked, his image did not. His gut churned. There was more to this than a power outage. The lift's air felt strange, dense and heavy, like an empty room that is ready to be occupied. Daniel turned and walked away, swiftly. The security office was cramped and stuffy. Daniel gazed at the lift feed while seated in front of the monitors. His hands were hesitant and rigid as they hovered over the keyboard. He rewinded the video by a few minutes. The lift was empty around 12:45 a.m. The doors slid closed at 12:46. They reopened at 12:47. Inside, someone was standing. Daniel's breathing became labored. He was the one, standing inside elevator 2, still, unmoving. However, he was present. He had just left. The monitor's figure raised its head. Daniel jerked back, chair scraping against the floor. The other him stared directly into the camera. The speakers erupted in a sudden flash of static. "Who the hell are you?" Daniel's heart froze. It was his own voice, but he hadn't said anything. He shook his hand over the radio. The screen flickered. Then, on the display, his other self tilted its head. "Who the hell are you?" The voice was exactly the same as before. Daniel's chest grew constricted. On the screen, the lips remained still. The realization crawled up his spine. It wasn't repeating him. It was the first to say it. He slammed the power button, shutting off the screen. The speakers hissed with static. A droning, low hum. Something shifted in the hotel. A door closed somewhere in the distance. Or perhaps it opened. With his hands clenched into fists and his breathing too shallow, Daniel sat in the dark security office. Hovering over the keyboard were his fingers. He pulled up the employee records, typed in his name. Nothing. He stopped breathing. No results. He felt his gut lurch. He typed once more. Daniel Carter. Safety. 6 years. Nothing. His name wasn't in the system. There was no employee by that name. His chair creaked as he pushed back, running a hand down his face. He seemed to be floating just above himself, his body disjointed. His radio crackled. Through came a muttered voice. "Daniel, it's time to come back down." His muscles tensed. Elevator 2 dinged. The doors opened smoothly, and waiting inside was himself. Daniel remained still. The lift's figure remained still. For a long moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the building. Then the other Daniel stepped forward. Not in a normal way. Like a marionette pulled by unseen threads, his foot moved first, followed by his torso. The lights overhead dimmed. Daniel's breath was too loud, and he took an uncontrollable step back. Like the weight of deep water, the lobby's air changed and pressed down. The figure said something. "You don't belong here anymore." Daniel's vision became hazy. After twisting and stretching too much, the room jerked back. The voice was incorrect. It was empty, but it was his. Hollow. Daniel's skin prickled with a deep, primitive terror. Something inside him whispered, "You won't be able to exit once you enter that lift." His hand clenched into a fist. Daniel the other grinned. He didn't use his mouth, with his eyes. And then, the doors of the lift closed. Daniel felt panic strike his chest. He sprang forward. His fingers hit the panel. The doors stopped. His own image, distorted in the twisted metal surface, gazed back at him for a moment. Then, there was no sign of the other Daniel. There was nobody in the lift. The panel flickered. The digital display glowed. B1. Then, the lift went down. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs as he stood still in the foyer, breathing irregularly. The doors of the lift had shut themselves. The empty cab was descending. Except it wasn't empty. Not at all. He balled his hands into fists. He had two options. Get out now, move on, and forget about everything. Or, a voice whispered inside his skull, distant, far away. If you get into that lift, you will never leave. Daniel hit the button to make the call. A pause. The doors then slid open. The elevator was waiting. The mirrored walls, distorted by years of heat and dust, extended indefinitely inside. His eyes appeared incorrect, but his reflection continued to stare back at him. Too dark, too deep. It was as though something had already started to draw him forward, and his body felt light. A foot inside, then the other. The doors closed behind him. Instinctively, he hit the lobby button. Nothing took place. His stomach dropped as the panel flickered again. Not B1, not L, just -1. The lift then started to move. It was a slow ride, too slow. The lift's air felt dense, as if you were entering a room that had just been vacated, but you could still feel their presence. The floor beneath his boots trembled with the buzz of the old cables. He waited for it to end while he gazed at the panel. He kept track of the seconds. 5, 10, 15. It should have stopped by now. He pushed the L button harder this time. The panel remained silent. His throat constricted into a knot. Then, a dull chime. The doors opened smoothly. It wasn't a basement on the floor outside the doors. It wasn't even on the Chancellor Hotel's property. It was a hallway, an unending door-lined hallway that stretches into the night. Uneven shadows were created by dimly lit sconces that flashed faintly throughout the wall-papered hallway. The air had a stale, almost metallic smell to it. Although it appeared to be a hotel floor, the design was incorrect. It was older, as if it had been left untouched for decades. There was a slight hum coming from far down the hallway. At the far end of the hall, something changed. A shadow. Tiny. Then it was gone. At the threshold, Daniel paused, his legs rigid, unwilling to go. The doors of the lift were still open. For now. The floor felt solid beneath him, too firm, like something was holding him in place. There was a little wooden desk ahead, where the lobby should have been. There was also a guest book on the desk. The pages were yellowed and wrinkled at the corners, but the pen next to it seemed brand new. He ran his fingertips across the cover. Deep black ink was used to neatly write the names inside. Most of them were completely faded, except for one. A new entry. He felt his gut freeze. Daniel Carter check-in date. 6 years ago. His throat tightened with each breath. His name had been written in his own handwriting. He turned the page, his fingers shaking. Checkout. N.A. The pen wobbled on the desk. For a moment, his eyesight became blurry and he lost his footing. No, 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 this isn't real, this isn't real. A soft creak echoed down the hall. His body became immobile. At the end of the hallway, something stood. It was a man in a suit. Not moving, not breathing. Head tilted. The light above him flickered. Daniel remained still. He knew, but the figure was too far away to see specifics. Its face would be incorrect, he knew. The hall echoed with a crisp click. The lights flickered once again. When they resumed, it was closer. Daniel's chest tightened. His legs refused to move despite his body screaming for him to run. Once more, the lights flickered. The figure was even closer. No movement, not a sound, just a little bit closer. Another flicker. It would be just before him. His thoughts exploded. Daniel whirled and ran towards the lift. The guest book slammed shut behind him. The figure did not follow. However, he sensed it was observing, awaiting. Daniel lunged into the elevator, slamming the L button over and over. It took too long for the doors to close. The mirrored wall's reflection of him seemed off, as if it had been there before him. The elevator shuddered. At last, the doors slid shut. The panel display flickered. Not L, not B1, just 0. The lift went up, but something was wrong. The numbers flashed too fast. First, second, third, fourth. The floors passed by quicker than reality allowed. 10, 20, 30. There were not 30 floors in this building. 50, 60, and 70. His ears popped as if he were climbing a mountain. Then, the lift slowed and stopped. The air was heavy with quiet. The doors opened smoothly. Daniel moved forward and entered the lobby. Everything had returned. The warm glow of the hallway lights, the front desk, and the chandeliers. His body was odd, as if he had just awoken from a long sleep. His gaze shifted to the security office and froze. Someone was sitting in the chair, watching the monitors. The other Daniel turned and smiled. The next morning, another security officer showed up for duty. The hotel was empty. No records of Daniel Carter were found. Elevator 2 had been out of order for decades. Furthermore, in the security logs, the final entry only said, "Check-in complete."